One of the most exciting things about working with Scripture is at any moment you can come across something in terms of a new way of looking at a passage, let's say, and the whole universe can change. This Biblical Studies program is going to be looking at a large part of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, but we will be taking three particular themes and tracing them throughout. The first is what I call the evocative and provocative call of wisdom. The second is the meaning and significance of gender, male and female in particular. And the third is the nature of power and violence. Often we assume that the way Scripture wants to impart wisdom to us is by simply telling us what to do in fairly clear language, so that the struggle is the struggle of obedience, but what we're actually called to do is pretty clear. It's just that our resistance perhaps to doing that is where the struggle lies. I've come to read Scripture very differently, and I think that much of it has got an evocative, provocative character that doesn't aim to tell us what to do, but wants to call us into participating in the meaning and the discernment of what it is that God is saying. One of the most famous or infamous narratives in the Old Testament is the Abraham narrative, in which we encounter the near sacrifice of Isaac. This is normally seen as a test of Abraham's either his faith or his obedience. Almost all interpreters will approach the narrative along those lines. One of the things that we'll look at in the first unit, which is on Genesis, is whether this is actually a different kind of test, that it's a test of discernment, a wisdom test, and that Abraham is being provoked and evoked into wisdom in this particular episode. And it's not just Abraham, because we as readers are also being provoked towards wisdom, and wisdom is evoking us towards wisdom. So in that sense, wisdom calls for wisdom. It calls forth our own wisdom as well. And if you approach the narrative in that way, as a call to discernment, we end up in the position that Abraham is in relation to this account of Abraham and Isaac. And Scripture becomes a much deeper, more challenging, but also more promising book at that point. So that particular theme, wisdom as evocative and provocative and as characterizing the way Scripture comes to us, is very, very central to the way we will look to engage the Bible in this Continuing Edge program. This is a well-known text from the end of Ecclesiastes. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And the word used for man there is, in Hebrew, is the same as the word that's used for Adam in Genesis 2. Many translations will want to make this inclusive at this point, so the New Revised Standard Version will talk about the whole duty of everyone. And this is a way to solve what's a kind of male generic language which seems to exclude women from humanity. So extremely understandable why that translation does that. There is another way of going on this, which I'll be exploring in the unit, and that is that when Scripture uses the language of man, so to speak, to represent humanity, it actually means the human being in need. It doesn't just mean humanity in all his glory, so to speak. And behind this is the Genesis 2 portrayal of Adam as the creature that needs help. And it is God throughout the Pentateuch who is referred to as the helper. And this gives us an important clue as why Eve is referred to as helper in Genesis 2, because she comes to represent God to the human being who is in need or who needs help. If you go with inclusive language too quickly, you actually obscure this kind of gender symbolism, which is, I think, quite promising and fruitful in terms of exploring a different way of looking at gender relations, because you have the female representing the divine and the male representing the creaturely or the human. And this gives us some possibilities to explore. A huge stumbling block for many people at the moment in relation to Scripture is the portrayal of the Canaanite genocide, which we find in the book of Joshua in particular and in other places. And many Christians will try and defend this and say that there's some good reason why God called for this. And other Christians are really quite horrified and not really sure what to do with this part of Scripture. I'll say a little bit about the kind of approach that we'll explore in this course. There's an interesting text in the first chapter of Matthew, which I'll just read. This is where Joseph encounters the angel, and he's told that Mary will bear a son, and you're to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Very familiar words, and we think, well, you know, we more or less know what that means. The name Jesus, Yeshua, is in effect the same name as Joshua. So Jesus is named after Joshua, and it's almost certainly the Joshua of the book of Joshua and of the Canaanite genocide that is in view here, because there are very few characters called Joshua elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. Why is Jesus named after Joshua? My hunch is that Jesus saving his people, Israel, from their sins is, at least in part, about saving his contemporaries from the sin, from the temptation of recapitulating the sins of the generation associated with Joshua, the Holy War impulse, which is something that Jesus clearly resists throughout the Gospels. Now, what does this do for our reading of the book of Joshua? Does that mean that we now have to throw it out and that we see Jesus as the new Joshua replacing the old Joshua, and we now cannot really read the book of Joshua? My approach would be to explore how the book of Joshua itself contains a nuanced critique of Joshua and the genocide impulse. The book of Joshua itself doesn't simply tell us that this is what God called for, but is busy criticizing that way of interpreting what God is all about. So the book of Joshua can stay in Scripture and can actually now serve a deeper criticism of religious violence than if we try and throw that book out. So that's one of the things we'll be exploring in this course.